And now it's time for a Q&A from you, the viewers, and I just got in a few questions like this the other day after my Huawei review of the tablet. And A here is asking, hey, I just read the news. The U.S. government says not to use Huawei products. Should I trust Huawei? So let's dive into this topic a bit and figure out what's going on here. So this is the most recent story that came out last week, that the U.S. government is reportedly trying to persuade allies to stop using Huawei equipment. Now, Huawei is one of the few companies in the world that makes the entire stack of hardware. So, for example, Apple, who makes the iPhone, makes all the chips inside the iPhone in addition to the phone itself. Huawei does that as well, but Samsung and many other companies use other people's chips for a majority of what the phone does, including communicating. So in the case of a Samsung phone, for example, it's using a Qualcomm chip, whereas Apple might use Qualcomm in some parts of its infrastructure, but a bulk of the processor is made by Apple itself. And Huawei makes their own chips for their mobile devices. In fact, the tablet that we looked at this past week has a Huawei processor inside. And I think the U.S. government is concerned because they don't have access to those chip designs to know what goes into it. I would suspect, and again, I don't have any information to back this up, but I would suspect that the U.S. government does have some idea as to what goes into an Apple chip and what goes into some of these Qualcomm chips, but it looks like they're concerned enough about these Huawei chips to recommend people not use them. And it's not just the phones, actually, they're concerned about. What they are concerned about is the new 5G infrastructure that's rolling out across the world for 5G mobile devices. 5G is slated to be fast enough to even maybe power your home internet as well, because they're going to do these short throw transmitters to power poles and everything. We've talked a little bit about this in the past, but it might be a real competitor to traditional landline internet. And if Huawei is making the chips that go into the 5G cell nodes that will be popping up on all these utility poles, the U.S. government is concerned that the Chinese might be able to drop in and eavesdrop what might be going across the network. And I think that's primarily what their concern is. Now, earlier this year, both Verizon and AT&T bowed to government pressure and stopped selling Huawei smartphones. You can still buy the phones in other places and then use them on those networks if the phones are compatible, but you can't get them directly from those two carriers. And the U.S. government was concerned that U.S. service members and other sensitive government employees might be picking up one of these phones and potentially being susceptible to Chinese eavesdropping, again, because Huawei makes the entire chip stack. Now, Huawei denies all of this. They say that they are a private company and there's no issues with their chips whatsoever. There was a government audit that was done a few years ago that didn't indicate any problems, but the U.S. government still remains concerned about the potential of this. And I think if you look at the strategies that people take in this cyber war that's been going on now for the last decade or so, the Chinese have a very different strategic approach to things because they make all the stuff that we use throughout the world. A majority of our things that we use every day, even our Apple computers and our Dell and HP computers, a bulk of those machines are made in China, and they have Chinese components potentially inside of them as well, in addition to chips that get brought to China from other places. And as a result of this, the Chinese may not need to do what the Americans have been doing, which is essentially siphoning off all of the world's internet traffic and putting it into a huge data center for analysis. They actually do this. It's tinfoil hat crazy, I know, but it's the truth. I wrote a big article about this a few years ago for a local publication here, and it's really quite scary what is probably sitting inside of this government server right now, even from private citizens like you and me. What they have done is basically made it so that they can store this information and then access it only if they get a warrant from a secret FISA court. So the actual retention of the data, the recording of the data, they don't consider to be wiretapping until they get a warrant to actually look at the data that they're storing. That's what the U.S. has been doing for a long time. The Chinese, though, don't necessarily have to do that because they make everything. And because of that, they can potentially put stuff into the product flow coming out of their country and be able to gain access to things more directly. There was an article in Business Week, which has become quite controversial, actually, about the fact that there was a motherboard manufacturer that they said had some chips installed on them that allowed the potential for backdoors. And these motherboards were being used in data centers, including, the article says, Apple. Apple vehemently denies that their motherboards were part of this and have actually, I think, threatened a lawsuit against Bloomberg. Bloomberg is standing by the story. So clearly they're hearing this from somewhere and are very concerned. And perhaps this may have leaked out of the U.S. intelligence community on purpose to get this out to the public, because we haven't had a direct government confirmation as to why they're so concerned about this stuff. But it only makes sense that if China is making everything, they have the ability to put stuff in these devices and spy on people, perhaps. And again, we don't know that they are definitely doing that, but we are in the midst of an international cyber war that's been going on for the better part of a decade. And I would see China doing this because they can and they have the ability to do so. And if we look back about a decade ago, there was a period where a number of Cisco routers being sold through major channels here in the U.S. were actually counterfeit and had backdoors built into them, which was potentially being used by China to spy on U.S. networks. These were big iron, routers that were being hooked up into major U.S. installations, and I think maybe made it into some telecommunication companies as well, all because these were all coming from China. They got inserted into the channel, essentially into the sales channel, and these devices were sold like any other Cisco router, yet they were counterfeit with backdoors installed. This has happened before. It can likely happen again. Whether or not Huawei is doing this directly now, I can't say. They say no. The U.S. government says maybe. So again, it's up to the consumers to make that decision. As for me, I like my iPhones. I probably wouldn't buy a Huawei phone, even though they're kind of nice. That does have me a bit concerned that the U.S. government is so concerned about them. Maybe I'm a little worried about the tablets as a result of this discussion. I think the PCs might be a little different just because a bulk of their chipsets in the PCs are not made by Huawei. But again, this is something that consumers need to keep in mind. And I do wish the government maybe would be a little more upfront with us about what these concerns are. And if they are as big as they are, I wonder why they haven't tried to make a broader effort to just keep these devices out of the country completely. One thing that I think might be happening here is that the government does enjoy relationships with these major chip and software manufacturers. What you see on screen here is a very cryptic program that Microsoft offers to governments, which allows them to get access to Microsoft source code. They've been doing that for a long time. They have shared source code with the U.S. government in the past. I'm sure they continue to do so now. I'm sure they're working with the NSA on securing Windows for government installations, and I'm sure the NSA learns things about securing Windows that they can use in a more offensive capacity. I'm sure Intel and other companies are also probably working with the government in some way or another, perhaps being coerced to do so or forced to do so, depending on the right method here, because again, most of these big companies also have big government contracts, and they don't want to interfere with those. And the government could always just force them through a security warrant to make them hand over whatever they need to keep going here. So there's a lot going on that we'll never know about. And it's not tinfoil hat stuff here, folks, but it is definitely something that's been going on for a while. And I suspect they don't have the same level of access with Huawei, which is leading to some of these issues that the U.S. government has with the company.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold-level supporters Chris Allegretta, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, Tom Albrecht, Gerard Newberg, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.